Okay, we're talking about the cold adaptations that Neanderthals had to survive in this really glacial northern environment. So I already mentioned the nose being slightly larger. Another feature that we see in Neanderthals is called midfacial prognathism, and that just means, we talked about prognathism already, but it's easy to forget. It's basically a snout. So it's not a snout like your dog might have, but it just means that the middle of the face, so the oronasal region, slightly projects from the rest of the face. Modern humans don't really have this. So some people say that that too might be associated with cooling the air. Other people say that it's just sort of a random thing. There was a pretty small population of Neanderthals. In number, they were nowhere near what we think of as how many modern people there were. So small sort of random changes would be more likely to happen in a Neanderthal population than a modern human population. So it might just be happenstance that they had that. I already mentioned that they were very robust and had short stature, but they were very thick. And this is called Bergmann's rule, the reason for this. It's associated with basically climactic temperature and body shape / size. So Bergmann's rule says that in colder temperatures, the stockier you are, whether you're a human or a rabbit or whatever, the stockier your body is, the better it conserves heat. So the less surface area that's exposed to the cold air, and the more all of the body heat is contained in the organism, the easier it is to stay warm. And we actually see that in Neanderthals. We see that their bodies are very robust and thick, very muscular. Muscle makes a lot of heat, so this was probably an adaptation for staying warm in this cold environment. So these are like actual adaptations, biological adaptations to the cold. But we see cultural adaptations too. We see use of fire. We see evidence for, we don't think they sewed very intricate clothes with sleeves and pant legs and all of these things, but we see the use of hides as potential clothing protection from the elements. We see evidence for not living in caves really widespread, but evidence of some sort of tent-type structure, possibly also made from a hide, something that could shelter them from the wind. And we see seasonal migration. So they lived in that small region of Europe and the Middle East, but there's still a lot of space to move around in there as a small group of people. So in the winter, you move a little bit farther south, and in the summer, you can move a little bit farther north. So we do see migrations to avoid sort of infringing cold on your territory. So both biological and cultural ways to survive the cold. I mentioned already that they lived based primarily on meat, that they hunted, but what is also important here is that they cooked at least much of the meat. Maybe not all of it. They probably weren't adverse to eating raw meat, but they did cook. And that's important. By cooking meat, which we see some evidence for in Homo erectus as well, by cooking meat, it basically gives you different nutritional value than eating raw meat. And that, the body uses that in different ways. So we see this cranial capacity increase, this brain size increase with Homo erectus. They cooked meat. We see a large cranial capacity in Homo neanderthalensis. They cooked meat. So we think that this cooking was very important for nutrition in the body, for brain function, and also just for the ability to chew this meat. Cooked meat is considerably easier to eat than raw meat. Your teeth break it up a lot better, so it saves energy for other things. So cooking is actually very, very important in terms of species, understanding how a species survived. Another thing that it's possible that Neanderthals subsisted on and potentially cooked was basically other Neanderthals. So we do see some evidence for cannibalism in Neanderthals. It irritates me because this gets blown out of proportion a lot, but I also feel like if I don't mention it, then it also gets blown out of proportion if you read about it somewhere else. So, yeah, there's some evidence for cannibalism in Neanderthals. There's also some evidence for cannibalism in modern Homo sapiens. Just because it happens in one social group doesn't mean it's a species-wide practice. There's evidence for cannibalism in some chimpanzees. Usually, these things happen under extreme circumstances. So, humans that have been isolated for extended periods of time and are starving to death sometimes resort to eating basically their dead companions. In all likelihood, that's what happened with Neanderthals. These are environments where people were very, very isolated, where they were barely surviving on the food that was available, and if a winter may have been particularly long, then they may have had to eat the bodies of their companions. There's no reason to think that this cannibalism was somehow ritualistic or anything else. All we see are some cut marks on some human bones, or not human, but Neanderthal bones, and sometimes we see Neanderthal bones disposed of in similar areas that we see other animal bones disposed. So that's where we're drawing this evidence of cannibalism. And it probably was based entirely on survival in a really extreme environment. So that was talking about remains. This is sort of pulling it a little bit further, and we're talking about burial. Burial is culturally very important. By burying the dead, you do a couple of things. We consider it sort of a laying the dead to rest sort of thing. It's religious in nature, and some people may not appreciate that classification, but it usually involves some concept of the afterlife, to bury remains. The other alternative is that we bury them to keep them away from scavenging wolves or coyotes or whatever the predominant species of scavenger might be in any given area, to keep disease away from our living people, whatever. You can take one or both, in some instances, of those interpretations of burial. What we know is that we don't see deliberate burial very often in Neanderthals, but we do see it in a couple of instances. So, to call something a deliberate burial, we need a couple of things. We need the skeleton to be more or less complete. And by more or less, I mean there can be a couple of little hand bones missing that maybe rodents walked away with. But the skeleton itself has to look like it was put there complete. It needs to be in place. It can't have been moved around. And it needs to be positioned in some way that it looks like it wasn't an accident. And that's when we can call something a burial. So we're going to spend a lot of time in this class actually talking about burials. This is just the first time. So when we use those classifications, we find about 4 specific instances of what we think were deliberate burials in Neanderthals. We see in the same cave that they found the individual with the amputated arm and the lost eye, we see in the back of the cave a deposit of Neanderthal bones, and on them we find enough wildflower pollen to infer that it was not actually just wildflower pollen that had blown in from the world, but it was deliberately put there. So basically, flowers were thrown on the remains of these individuals. That is important too, because that's somehow, why do you deposit things on the graves of loved ones, if not for some sort of respect or potentially ritualistic purpose. In Uzbekistan, there's actually a young boy that was buried surrounded by goat horns, which also looks sort of ritualistic. And in Russia, we see infants that were deliberately buried. And I apologize, Russia is spelled wrong right there, missing the I. So we do see some evidence of it. We don't see widespread evidence of it. So widespread evidence is what we look for. In humans, there's obviously widespread evidence for burial. In modern humans, there's obviously widespread evidence for symbolic behavior in general. So burial is sometimes just grouped in with symbolic behavior because of the ritual or potentially religious undertones associated with it. And religion is a strong word, but ritual perhaps sums it up a little bit better. Language is a symbolic behavior as well. You are listening to these words. You can't even see me right now, but you're listening to these words and they are causing processes to go on in your brain, and you can interpret what I mean just from hearing these things. That's symbolic. Even these words that are written on the screen, they're just random shapes, but you put them together and they mean something to you. That's symbolism. Personal adornment, jewelry, is symbolism. I wear a wedding ring to symbolize that I am married. I wear scarves in the winter, and I pick scarves with flowers on them because they're pretty, and I pick scarves with skulls on them because I study skulls. They somehow are symbolic of my personality. Apparently I like pretty things and skulls, which is weird. So all of these things, they symbolize something else, right? In part, I could wear a scarf just to stay warm, but I choose to wear scarves with particular designs that evoke some sort of emotion in me or some response. So symbolism. Symbolism is something that we still say is very human. So the fact that we don't see widespread evidence for it in Neanderthals is how we can sort of justify drawing a dividing line between modern humans and Neanderthals. Some of those late-stage Neanderthals around 30,000 years ago, that's where we see a couple of burials, and we see these shells that have holes drilled into them, potentially as jewelry. We see it a couple of times, but it's not widespread, and it's only in these late-stage Neanderthals. So some people argue, oh, they must have only learned that from modern humans that were living in the same period at the same time. That, again, seems very species-centric to me. But because we don't see it everywhere, it's really hard to classify. So we do sort of draw that human and potentially less human line in there due to this lack of widespread symbolic behavior. So one of the big things that we talk about then is, are we related to Neanderthals or not? And I already gave you some spoilers and said that we do have Neanderthal DNA. But there still are these arguments about, so are Neanderthals are they modern humans that look different, or are they not? Most people say they're not, okay, and we know that they evolved in Europe, great. Every other hominin appears to have evolved in Africa, so are we related, are we not related? How does this all work? And so these are a couple of different sort of illustrations that can show how you can interpret the evolution of Neanderthals and archaic Homo sapiens and Homo erectus. You can decide to lump all of these relatively modern hominin together and say that they're just different regional populations of basically the same species. Everybody could interbreed if they wanted to. Or you can say they're totally separate. Neanderthals are sort of a dead end here. So the more modern way to look at it is actually probably many of these species that coexisted at the same time could interbreed with one another. Maybe not entirely successful every time, but there is gene flow between groups. We do have some Neanderthal DNA. So it was probably a little more fluid than we necessarily think it is just based on the fossil record or the skeletons that are preserved. So we do see evidence that modern humans probably did mate in some instances, not widespread, but in some instances, with Neanderthals. Based on common definitions of species, that would mean that in some way Neanderthals have to fit not totally separate from modern humans. So just be aware that there are a lot of arguments about how we group and split different groups of hominin. So we're going to stop here and move into the fourth installment of the lecture at this point and discuss these tools in more detail.